Stay, boy! I say sit! Get back here now!
The guard dog had been trained to attack anyone who set foot on that yacht without clearance, and in 11 months of service, she had never once broken that training. Until the afternoon, an old man in a faded ball cap walked down the dock, and she broke it in front of 40 guests, and the whole deck went so quiet you could hear the halyards ticking against the masts. Walter Hendricks had not meant to be anywhere near the Silver Meridian that afternoon. He was 71 years old, and he moved along the marina boardwalk the way old sailors move, rolling slightly at the hips even on dry land. A gait 30 years at sea had carved into him so deep it would outlast his knees. His hands were thick and cross-hatched with old rope burns gone silver with age, and he carried a bucket of marine hardware in one of them, because the only work anybody offered a man his age around the Belhaven Marina was the kind that paid cash and didn't ask for a resume, swapping out corroded cleats, running new bilge lines, whatever the dock master needed done before the weekend crowd came through wanting their slips to look sharp. He wore the same faded ball cap he'd worn for going on 15 years, sun-bleached almost white across the brim, with a small embroidered anchor over the front that had worn down to a ghost of thread. Most people who passed him on the boardwalk didn't look twice. That was fine by Walt. He'd stopped needing people to look twice a long time ago. He lived 3 docks over from the marina's superyacht row, in a live-aboard sailboat older than some of the deckhands who worked the big boats, a 32-foot sloop called the Constance that he'd bought for almost nothing off a widow 20 years back and had been slowly, patiently keeping alive ever since with a combination of stubbornness and salvaged parts. The cabin smelled of diesel and salt and the particular mustiness of a boat that had spent too many winters afloat, and Walt slept most nights on a narrow berth with a wool blanket that had gone thin at the edges, and ate mostly out of cans he warmed on a single-burner stove, and told himself, most days, that this was a life and not merely the tail end of one. He had been Navy, 26 years of it, most of that time attached to a specialized unit most people had never heard of and wouldn't have believed if they had, a maritime force protection detachment that ran military working dogs aboard ships and in ports across 3 oceans, sniffing for explosives and contraband on hulls and cargo holds in places where a wrong guess could sink more than a career. Walt had been a dog handler before the term K-9 handler was the kind of thing you saw on recruiting posters, back when the Navy still figured out the job by trial and error, and men like Walt were the ones doing the figuring. He'd run 6 dogs over the course of his career, one after another, each one trained by his own 2 hands from green pup to combat-ready operator, and he'd have told you, if you caught him on a night with a little rum in him and nobody around to be embarrassed in front of, that every single one of those dogs had mattered to him more than most of the men he'd served alongside, and that he did not consider that a strange thing to say, not even a little. The work itself had never been the kind that made for exciting stories at a bar, and Walt had learned early on not to bother trying to explain it to civilians who wanted something more dramatic than the truth. Most days aboard a cargo vessel or working a port facility meant hours of patient, methodical searching that turned up nothing at all. Hull inspections in the gray Pradon light off some port whose name most Americans couldn't have found on a map, container after container cleared clean, the dog's nose the only instrument in the whole chain of command that never lied and never got tired of doing its job right. The moments that mattered, the ones that justified every hour of the boring work, came rarely and without warning. A dog sitting down hard and still in front of a shipping container in Bahrain that turned out to be carrying enough explosive material to have taken out half a pier. A positive alert on a fishing trawler off the coast of Djibouti that led, eventually, to the unraveling of a smuggling operation 3 years in the making. Walt had been present for 4 such moments across his career. 4 times a dog's nose had stood between disaster and an ordinary Tuesday, and he counted those 4 afternoons, privately, among the only unambiguously good things he'd done with his life. The last dog he trained, and the one he thought about more than any of the others, on nights when sleep didn't come easy on the narrow berth of the Constance, was a Dutch shepherd named Bexley. He'd raised her from an 8-week-old pup at the Navy's working dog program down in Texas, spent 11 months getting her ready, and then run with her for 4 years across 2 deployments doing explosive detection work on cargo vessels and port facilities from the Strait of Hormuz to the Horn of Africa, the kind of work that never made headlines because when it went right, nothing happened at all, no boat blew up, no headline got written. The absence of disaster being the entire point, and also entirely invisible to anyone who wasn't the man standing next to the dog, when she sat down hard and still in front of a shipping container that turned out to be carrying something it shouldn't have. Bexley had a habit, unique to her among all the dogs Walt had ever handled, of tapping her paw twice against a person's shin when she wanted attention rather than barking or pawing at their hand. A soft double tap, deliberate, almost polite, that Walt had never trained into her and had never seen in another working dog before or since. He used to joke that she'd invented her own knock. She had been, from the very start, a dog who worked best when she trusted the man on the other end of the leash completely, and Walt remembered, with a clarity that surprised him even now, the 11 months it had taken to earn that trust the first time, the early weeks when she'd hesitate at a compound entrance until Walt walked it himself first, the slow months of drilling the same search patterns over and over on a training range outside San Diego until her hesitation became confidence. Until confidence became the kind of fearless, methodical competence that let her walk into a darkened cargo hold at 2 in the morning without so much as a flinch, because she had learned, over those 11 months, that the man beside her would never once send her somewhere he hadn't already decided was worth the risk himself. It had taken 11 months to build that. It had taken the Navy a single afternoon and a signature to take it away. The Navy had retired Walt at 52. A medical separation after a fall on a wet deck in rough seas off Djibouti left him with a shattered hip and a spine that never quite forgave the impact, and the retirement had come with a pension that sounded reasonable on paper and evaporated fast against the actual cost of living, and a goodbye to Bexley that the Navy handled with the same brisk, procedural indifference it handled most things. She was reassigned to a new handler at a stateside facility while Walt was still in a hospital bed learning to walk with a cane, and by the time he was mobile enough to ask about her, the paperwork trail had already gone the way paperwork trails go in large bureaucracies, thin and then thinner and then gone. He'd written letters. He'd made calls. He'd gotten eventually a form response telling him that working dog reassignment records were not releasable to former handlers absent a formal request through channels that turned out in practice to be channels leading nowhere at all. He had let it go, the way a man lets go of things he cannot change, which is to say he had not let it go at all. He had simply stopped speaking of it and carried it instead, quiet and constant, the way he carried the ache in his hip before a storm. That was 19 years ago now. Walt did not expect, on an ordinary Thursday afternoon with a bucket of hardware in his hand and the sun coming down hard and bright off the water, to ever see Bexley again in this life. He had made his peace, or told himself he had, with the idea that some things the Navy took from you simply stayed taken. He had tried in those first bewildering years of civilian life to explain the shape of that particular grief to people who had no framework for it. His ex-wife, Carol, gone now 11 years to a heart attack that had taken her fast and without warning in a grocery store parking lot in Pensacola, had listened to him try to describe it exactly once, early in their marriage, back when he still thought talking about it might help. He'd told her that losing Bexley to the Navy's reassignment process had felt, in some ways, worse than any of the 6 deployments that came before it, because a deployment ended, you knew, going in, there was a date on the far side of it, however distant, however uncertain. Losing a dog to paperwork had no far side. There was no homecoming scheduled for it, no flag folded and handed over with a solemn thank you, just a form and a signature, and a young corporal at a stateside kennel who couldn't have been older than 23 telling Walt, not unkindly, that regulations didn't permit personal effects, and a working dog counted, technically, as government property, not personal effects, to transfer with a separating service member absent specific medical or psychological justification that Walt, still learning to walk on a hip full of new hardware, had not had the presence of mind or the paperwork to properly pursue in time. Carol had listened to the whole of it, patient and quiet, and at the end had simply said that some men came home from war carrying the war, and Walt seemed to have come home carrying a dog-shaped hole instead, and that she didn't think that was a lesser thing to carry, only a stranger one to explain to people who hadn't been there. He had not talked about it much since, not to Carol in the later years of their marriage, before it quietly ended the way some marriages do, not out of anger, but out of 2 people slowly running out of things to say to each other across a distance neither had chosen. Not to his daughter, Michelle, who called from Charlotte twice a month and asked, in the careful voice of a grown child managing an aging parent from a distance, whether he'd thought any more about moving off that boat and into some place with an actual furnace, a conversation Walt deflected every single time with the same tired joke about furnaces being for men who'd given up on the water. Not to anyone at all, in fact, except on the worst nights, out loud to the dark of the Constance's cabin, where the only witness was the creak of old rigging and the slap of harbor water against the hull, and where a man could say a dog's name into the dark without anyone asking him to explain why his voice had gone thick saying it. The mornings were easier than the nights, as they usually are for men who carry things they don't discuss. Walt kept a rhythm to his days that had not changed much in 2 decades. Up before the sun, coffee boiled black and strong on the single burner, a walk down the length of the marina to check which boats needed which small mercy that day, and work whatever work there was until his hip told him, in its own blunt and reliable language, that the day was finished whether or not the job was. It was a narrow life, built around tides and weather, and the small, specific satisfactions of a corroded fitting made sound again, but it had held together, more or less, for 19 years, and Walt had stopped expecting it to hold anything more than that. The Silver Meridian was the largest vessel in Belhaven Marina by a wide margin, 180 feet of gleaming white hull and dark-tinted glass that belonged to a man named Julian Castellane, a hedge fund principal whose name showed up often enough in the financial press that even Walt, who read very little beyond the shipping forecast and the occasional second-hand paperback, recognized it. Castellane was hosting something that afternoon, a charity gala for some foundation with his own name attached to it, the deck strung with white lights not yet lit against the daylight, caterers moving up and down the gangway with trays, a string quartet setting up near the aft lounge, 40-some guests in linen and silk drifting across the teak decking with champagne flutes catching the sun. And at the base of the gangway, leashed but clearly more decoration than restraint, stood the yacht's guard dog, a lean, dark-coated Dutch shepherd the security detail called Titan, purchased 11 months earlier from a private contractor specializing in executive protection canines for a sum that would have covered a year of Walt's dock work twice over, trained, according to the contractor's glossy brochure, to deter and if necessary neutralize any unauthorized boarding of the vessel. Walt had no reason to be near the gangway of the Silver Meridian. His errand that afternoon was 3 slips down, replacing a corroded stern cleat on a much smaller boat belonging to a retired schoolteacher named Pearl, who paid him in cash and homemade banana bread, and the most direct route from the marina office to Pearl's slip happened to run along the same stretch of boardwalk where Castellane's gangway met the dock. He was not thinking about the yacht at all. He was thinking, if he was thinking about anything, about whether Pearl's bread would still be warm when he finished the job, and about the particular ache that had settled into his hip that morning that told him, with the reliability of 30 years' experience, that weather was coming in off the water within the day. The dog smelled him before she saw him. Walt would understand that later, turning the moment over and over in his mind the way you turn over something precious and half-believed, because that was always how it worked with a properly trained detection dog. Scent arrived first, faster than sight, faster than sound, and everything else followed the nose. He watched it happen without understanding, at first, what he was watching. The Dutch shepherd at the base of the gangway, who had stood placid and bored through 2 hours of arriving guests, went suddenly rigid, head coming up, nostrils working the air in short, sharp pulls, and then she was moving, not the controlled heel her handler expected, but a full, straining lunge against the leash, dragging the young security contractor, holding it 3 full steps down the dock before he dug his heels in and hauled back with both hands. There is a particular stillness that comes over a man who has spent decades learning to read the tell's thaw. To precede violence, or precede rescue, or precede any sudden shift in the order of things, and Walt felt that stillness settle over him now, even as his conscious mind lagged a full beat behind whatever older, deeper part of him had already understood what was unfolding. He had felt it before, exactly this, the world narrowing to a single point of urgent focus, sound dropping away, the particular electric clarity that used to arrive right before a compound door came off its hinges. He felt his own pulse in his ears. He felt the bucket handle biting into his palm and did not, for several seconds, register that he was still holding it. "Tighten heel," the handler snapped, a broad-shouldered man in a black polo with an earpiece curling behind one ear, and the dog ignored him completely, which Walt understood, even in that first confused second, was itself extraordinary. A properly trained protection dog did not ignore a heel command from her own handler. Not for anything short of an emergency her training told her overrode the command. She kept pulling, straining every muscle in her lean body toward the old man standing 40 feet away with a bucket of hardware in his hand, and then she began to bark, except it wasn't quite a bark, not the deep territorial warning bark Walt would have expected from a protection dog confronting a stranger. It was higher, more urgent, threaded through with something that made the hair rise on Walt's arms before his conscious mind had caught up to what his ears were telling him. Because he recognized that sound, had heard some close cousin of it 1,000 times across 4 years and 2 deployments, and some deep unconscious part of him went very still and very cold standing there on the boardwalk. 40 feet was not a great distance, not for a man who had once covered considerably worse ground under considerably worse conditions, but it felt in that moment like the longest 40 feet Walt had crossed in 19 years, each second stretched thin and strange, the ordinary sounds of the marina, gulls, halyards, a distant outboard motor, all of it receding to a dull hum beneath the single sharpening fact of a dog's voice calling out something that was not quite a bark and not quite a cry, something closer, if Walt let himself think about it honestly, to a name. "Sir, I need you to step back," the handler called to Walt, still hauling on the leash, sweat starting on his forehead now, because the dog outweighed him in raw determination if not in actual pounds, and was making a liar of every word in the executive protection brochure. "Sir, she doesn't do this. I don't know what's, sir. Please back away from the vessel." Walt did not back away. Walt could not in that moment have told you why his feet were not obeying the handler's instruction, except that some part of him already knew, with a certainty that bypassed thought entirely and arrived instead in his chest like a physical blow, exactly what he was looking at, and his body had simply stopped taking orders from anyone but that certainty. He set the bucket of hardware down on the dock, slow, and he did something he had not done in 19 years, something his hands remembered before his mind gave them permission. He brought 2 fingers to his lips and gave a short, low whistle, 3 notes descending, the exact call he had used to settle Bexley during 1,000 training sessions on the deck of a ship half a world away, back when she was young and green and still learning that the world could be trusted. The dog went silent instantly. Not calm, every muscle in her body was still coiled tight as a spring, but silent, and in the sudden quiet that followed, Walt watched her stop straining against the leash and instead sit, hard and fast, dropping into the position with a discipline that had nothing to do with the handler's training and everything to do with something laid down years earlier, deeper than 11 months of executive protection contract work could ever reach. The handler, stunned into stillness himself, let the leash go slack. "Bexley," Walt said, quiet, his voice cracking on the second syllable in a way that embarrassed him even as it happened, because he had not said that name out loud to a living creature in 19 years, had barely let himself think it most days for the ache it carried. "Bexley, girl." The dog crossed the last 30 feet of dock in 4 strides, and Walt braced himself the way you brace for an impact you have no intention of avoiding, and she hit him with her full weight, front paws coming up onto his chest, her head driving hard up under his chin, the exact way she used to when she was a young dog, and the world had got to be too much, and she needed the solid, unmoving fact of her handler to remind her where the ground was. Walt's hip screamed at the impact, and he did not care in the slightest. He got both arms around her neck, this dog he had raised from 8 weeks old, this dog who had found things that would have killed good men if she hadn't, this dog he had said goodbye to on a hospital gurney with a shattered hip, and had never expected, not once in 19 years of trying to make his peace with it, to hold again, and he felt something break open in his chest that he had kept sealed shut for a very long time, and he did not try to stop the sound that came out of him, low and rough, that might, to anyone watching, have sounded almost like a sob. Nobody on the deck of the Silver Meridian said a word. 40 guests in linen and silk, champagne flutes forgotten in their hands, the string quartet's bows stilled mid-note, every single one of them watching an old man in a faded ball cap kneel on a public dock with his arms around a $100,000 guard dog that had just, in front of God and the entire assembled donor class of 3 different charitable foundations, abandoned her post, her training. And 11 months of paid protection duty to press her skull into a stranger's collarbone like she was trying to climb back inside a version of the world that made sense. Julian Castellane came down the gangway himself, drawn by the sudden silence, the way a man is always drawn by silence at his own party, still holding his own champagne flute, and stopped at the bottom of it, looking at the scene on the dock with an expression that started as irritation and shifted, as he took in the details, the tears the old man wasn't bothering to hide, the dog's utter and complete surrender of every instinct her expensive training had drilled into her, into something more complicated. Confusion, and beneath the confusion, though he would not have named it that way himself in the moment, the first faint stirrings of something that felt uncomfortably like being caught. "What the hell is going on here?" Castellane said, to nobody in particular, to everybody, and the handler, still holding a leash that had gone entirely irrelevant, opened his mouth and had nothing useful to offer. Walt was the one who answered, still on his knees on the dock, one hand buried in the ruff of fur behind Bexley's ears, the other braced against the boards to keep his bad hip from giving out entirely. "I trained this dog," he said, and his voice came out steadier than he felt, the old command voice surfacing from somewhere beneath 30 years of rust. "Raised her from a pup. Ran with her for 4 years, Navy working dog program, maritime detection. Her name's Bexley. Serials tattooed inside her left ear if you want to check it. Starts with a Whiskey Tango designation, Navy program code." He looked up, finally, at the man in the $2,000 linen shirt standing at the base of his own gangway with a champagne flute going warm in his hand. "Where'd you get her from?" Castellane's jaw worked for a moment before anything came out. "A contractor," he said finally. "Executive protection outfit, does K-9 placement for private security. Papers said she was a civilian-trained protection dog, no service history. Cost me $40,000. He looked down at the dog, at the way she hadn't moved an inch off the old man's chest, at the way her whole body had gone loose and trembling in a manner nothing in 11 months of watching her work the deck had prepared him to see. "You're telling me that's not true?" "I'm telling you," Walt said. "That dog was retired from a Navy detachment 19 years ago, and somewhere between that retirement and your dock, somebody erased a service record and sold a decorated military working dog to you as a civilian animal with a made-up pedigree. And I'd very much like to know who." The silence that followed that sentence was, if anything, deeper than the one before it, because 40 guests who had come for canapés and a tax write-off suddenly understood they were witnessing something considerably more interesting than either. Castellane set his champagne flute down on the gangway railing, slow, the gesture of a man buying himself time to think, and when he spoke again his voice had lost its irritated edge entirely, replaced by something flatter and more careful. "Come aboard," he said. "Both of you. I think we need to have a longer conversation than the one we're having on my dock." What followed over the next several hours, the gala continuing awkwardly around them, caterers still circulating trays of food nobody was much in the mood for any more, the string quartet eventually packing up early at a discreet signal from Castellane's event coordinator, was the kind of conversation that Walt had not expected to have in this lifetime. Sitting in a leather chair in a yacht's private study, with a dog pressed against his leg who had not left his side for one single minute since the dock, her paw resting, deliberate and possessive, across the top of his boot. The study itself was the kind of room Walt had only ever seen in magazines left behind on dock benches, dark wood paneling. Wall of framed photographs of Castellane shaking hands with men whose faces Walt half recognized from the news, a bar cart with bottles worth more, probably, than the Constance's last engine overhaul. Walt sat in it, feeling the particular discomfort of a man whose boots had tracked dock grime onto a rug that likely cost more than he'd earned in the last 5 years combined, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he did not much care. Bexley's weight against his leg made the room feel smaller and more manageable than it had any right to, the same way it always had, on ships considerably grander than this one, back when the two of them worked together and neither cared much for the trappings of the vessel they happened to be standing on. "Tell me about her," Castellane said. Once a steward had brought coffee neither man touched and then withdrawn, closing the study door behind him with a soft click. "The dog. Start wherever makes sense to you." So Walt told him, not the whole of it, not at first. He was not, by nature, a man who unspooled himself easily in front of strangers, let alone a stranger whose net worth he could not have guessed within several zeros, but enough. The Navy program down in Texas. The 8-week-old pup with ears too big for her head and a nose that never once in 11 months of training missed a planted scent, not even the ones the instructors tried to make impossible to catch. The 4 years after that, 2 deployments, cargo holds and shipping containers from the Strait of Hormuz to the Horn of Africa, work that never made headlines because the entire point of it was that nothing happened, no explosion, no headline, just the quiet, invisible fact of disaster prevented by a dog's nose and a handler's patience. And then, Castellane said, when Walt's account trailed into the part he found hardest to tell, the Navy just took her back. Wasn't malicious, Walt said, though he heard, even as he said it, how many years it had taken him to be able to say that without his jaw tightening. Wasn't anybody trying to hurt anybody, just a system that doesn't have a box on the form for what a dog like that means to the man who raised her. I was in a hospital bed relearning how to walk. By the time I could ask questions, there wasn't anybody left to ask them to. Kalch, standing near the study door through most of this, cleared his throat at that point, the particular sound of a man about to say something he'd rather not. "Sir," he said to Castellane, "if what he's saying checks out, and I've got no reason yet to think it doesn't, we need to be asking some hard questions about Meridian Tactical Canine's paperwork. I ran their standard background package same as I always do. Everything came back clean. Civilian training certification, no service flags, no red marks anywhere in the chain." "Which means somebody built a clean package on purpose," Walt said. "Not an accident, not a clerical mix-up. Somebody with access to the real records took the time to make a false one look better than the truth." Castellane sat with that a long moment, turning his own untouched coffee cup slowly on its saucer, and when he looked up, whatever irritation had carried him down the gangway an hour earlier had drained out of his face entirely, replaced by something harder and more focused. The look, Walt would learn over the following months, of a man who had built a fortune largely on his own low tolerance for being made a fool of. $40,000, he said, quiet. "I paid $40,000 for a dog that was stolen from a war hero, and I never asked a single question that would have told me that, because the paperwork looked good and the dog was well trained, and that was all I cared to know." He looked at Bexley, still pressed against Walt's leg, still trembling faintly with the aftershock of whatever had broken open in her on the dock. "That's on me. Whatever else this turns out to be, that part's on me." "Wasn't your hand that falsified the records," Walt said, "but I'll take you meaning it." Kalch's investigators started that same night, working off the yacht's own guest Wi-Fi at a laptop set up on the study's mahogany desk, and Walt sat through the first 2 hours of it mostly in silence, one hand resting in the fur at the back of Bexley's neck, listening to men half his age talk about shell corporations and warehouse leases in a language he only partly followed, understanding, all the same, exactly what it meant that they were looking at all. "I want everything you have on them," Walt said, and something in his tone, flat, patient, utterly without heat, made Kalch sit up a little straighter, because it was the tone of a man who had once been very good at extracting information from people who did not want to give it, and had not entirely forgotten how that work went. "Every dog they've placed in the last 3 years, every name on their books. I don't care what it costs you to get I tell you." It took 11 days of quiet, methodical digging, Kalch's private investigator contacts running down business filings and warehouse leases, Walt working his own end of it through Ray's, the old ranger contact he'd known peripherally through a joint services K9 conference years back and who still had friends in the military working dog program's records office, before the full shape of it came clear, and when it did, it was uglier and larger than anyone at the table that first evening had guessed. The work itself in those 11 days fell into a rhythm Walt recognized from a very different chapter of his life, and he found, somewhat to his own surprise, that his mind slotted back into it easily, the same patient, unhurried thoroughness he'd once brought to searching a cargo hold inch by inch rather than trusting a first pass. He spent his mornings on dock work same as always, Bexley trailing him boat to boat, but his afternoons now belonged to a folding table set up in the Constance's cramped cabin, spread with printouts Kalch's investigator forwarded over business registration filings for Meridian Tactical Canine, a tangle of shell entities layered 3 deep, a warehouse lease out past the county line signed under a name that turned out, after 2 phone calls, to be a cousin of the actual owner, Devin Farrow, who had apparently learned early in his career that a paper trail was only dangerous if you left your own name on it. Ray's, for his part, worked a different angle entirely, calling in favors with 3 separate contacts still inside the military working dog program's administrative apparatus, men and women who remembered Walt from his handling days and who did not love hearing that a records clerk inside their own building had been quietly gutting the integrity of the program's disposition files for profit. It was one of those contacts, a records supervisor named Colonel Patricia Wren, who Walt had trained a green Malinois alongside 22 years earlier, who finally pulled the thread that unraveled the whole thing. A pattern, once you knew to look for it, of retirement dispositions filed by the same records clerk, Curtis Ambrose, that clustered suspiciously around dogs with unusually high training valuations, each one marked euthanized, medical, or unfit for civilian rehoming in the official file, with no corresponding veterinary documentation anywhere in the supporting record. 11 files, over 4 years, all bearing Ambrose's signature, all missing the paperwork that should have accompanied a euthanasia decision, all quietly closed before anyone thought to ask why. "I want their names," Walt told Kalch, the evening the full list came together, the two of them sitting across the Constance's small folding table with Bexley stretched out between them, her head resting across Walt's boot the way it did now most evenings. "Every handler on record for every dog on that list. I don't care how long it takes." Kalch, to his credit, did not treat the request as an inconvenience. He'd spent, by his own account, 11 months not asking the questions he should have asked about where a $40,000 protection dog with impeccable training actually came from, and something about watching Bexley's paw rest deliberate and possessive across an old sailor's boot seemed to have rearranged his priorities considerably. "Give me a week," he said, and it took him 9 days, but he delivered. Bexley, it turned out, had been one of 11 dogs run through that pipeline over 4 years. Walt sat with that number for a long while after Kalch's investigator laid it out on the study table, 11 names and 11 service numbers on a printed sheet, and felt something harden in him that had nothing to do with getting Bexley back, because he already had that, already had her weight leaning against his leg every hour of every day since the dock, and everything to do with the other 10. 10 handlers somewhere, he thought, who had gotten the same form letter he had, the same closed door, the same quiet, permanent grief they'd been told to simply carry and not speak of again. He made the first of those calls himself, sitting at the folding table in the Constance's cabin, with the printed list in front of him and Bexley's chin resting warm across his knee, and found that his hands were not quite steady dialing a number that belonged to a stranger who nonetheless shared with him the exact particular shape of a loss most people had no framework to understand. The first name on the list was a retired Coast Guard petty officer named Marcus Webb, living outside Norfolk, and when Walt explained who he was and why he was calling, there was a long silence on the line, long enough that Walt asked, quiet, whether he was still there. "Yeah," Webb said finally, his voice gone thick in a way Walt recognized immediately, because he'd heard that same thickness in his own voice not 3 weeks earlier, kneeling on a dock wit. H's arms around a dog he'd thought he'd never see again. "Yeah, I'm here. Just nobody said that dog's name to me in 6 years. I didn't think anybody ever would again." Not every call went so cleanly. There was a handler in Ohio, a former Air Force Security Forces sergeant, who did not answer 3 attempts and finally, on the 4th, answered only long enough to say, in a voice gone flat and controlled in a way that told Walt everything about how much it was costing him to keep it that way, that he appreciated the call but he'd made his peace with it years ago and didn't see the use in reopening something that had taken him a long time to close, and Walt had respected that, had said so plainly. And left the door open without pushing it further, understanding better than most that not every wound wants the same kind of tending, and that a man's right to leave a door shut mattered every bit as much as another man's right to finally walk back through one. Of the 11 dogs, investigators located 6 still alive and traceable, placed with private owners across 4 states. 4 of those owners, once the true history came clear, agreed without hesitation to reunite the dogs with their original handlers, understanding immediately what they'd unknowingly participated in. One of them, a retired executive in Scottsdale who'd paid $35,000 for a Belgian Malinois named Rooster, drove the dog cross-country himself rather than trust a shipping crate, a 4-day trip he later told Walt when the two of them spoke by phone. He considered the most worthwhile thing he'd done with his money in a decade. One owner fought it in court for 3 months before a federal judge made the decision for her, a bitter and public dispute that made regional news, and in a strange twist neither Walt nor Castellane had anticipated, drew enough press attention to the underlying fraud that 2 more defrauded handlers, previously unaware their own dogs might be traceable, came forward on their own. In one dog, a black Labrador named Sable, who had done explosive detection work in the same maritime program years after Bexley's retirement, had died of old age 8 months before the investigation ever started, and her handler, a woman named Sergeant First Class Denise Acaffer, now working as a school resource officer in Georgia, cried on the phone with Walt for a long time when he called to tell her what had happened to her dog and why she'd never been able to find out anything about her retirement, and thanked him afterward for calling anyway, for making sure she at least, finally, knew the truth of it instead of the silence she'd been carrying for 6 years. "I used to think maybe I'd done something wrong," Acaffer told him, near the end of that call, her voice raw. "Filled out a form wrong, missed a deadline, something. 19 years of army, and I couldn't figure out how I'd lost a dog to paperwork. It never once occurred to me somebody just stole her. That's the part that gets me too, Walt said. How long they let us believe that was our fault. Bexley herself moved aboard the Constance permanently within the month, a transition that involved considerably more paperwork and considerably more genuine cooperation from Castellane's legal team than Walt had expected going in, and the old sloop, which had spent 20 years being just barely enough boat for one man, adjusted itself around the presence of a 100-pound Dutch shepherd with the same patient stubbornness Walt had used to keep the vessel afloat for 2 decades. She slept curled against the foot of his berth, her weight a warm, solid anchor Walt had not realized, until it returned to him. He had spent 19 years missing at the exact size and shape it had left. She still did the thing with her paw, the soft double tap against his shin, whenever she wanted his attention rather than his instruction, a habit that had apparently survived 11 months of executive protection training completely intact, buried but never actually erased, waiting the whole time for the one hand it had been built to answer to. The first weeks were not, Walt would be the first to admit, entirely easy. 11 months of executive protection conditioning did not simply evaporate because a familiar whistle had cracked something open in her, and there were nights in that first stretch when Bexley startled awake from sleep with a low, warning growl at some sound Walt's own ears couldn't catch, some habituated readiness for threat that Meridian Tactical Canine's trainers had drilled into her without ever once asking whether the dog underneath all that conditioning had wanted it. Walt recognized the pattern immediately because it was, in its shape if not its particulars, the same pattern he saw in his own reflection some mornings, a nervous system trained so thoroughly for vigilance that it forgot, sometimes, how to stand down even when standing down was safe. He did not try to force her out of it. He had learned, over 4 years of raising her the first time and 26 years of learning what dogs and men both needed in order to heal, that you could not order an animal into trusting you, only make yourself, day after day, the kind of steady and predictable presence that trust eventually had no good reason left to refuse. So he built a routine, the same patient architecture he'd have used training any green working dog, except this time the aim wasn't readiness for threat, but the slow, deliberate unwinding of it. Mornings began the same way for both of them now: coffee for Walt, a measured bowl of food for Bexley set down in the same spot on the cabin sole every single day, because dogs healed faster, Walt had always believed, with the small tyrannies of routine than with any amount of well-meant unpredictability. Afternoons meant a walk the full length of the marina and back, Bexley's gait falling naturally into step beside Walt's rolling, hip-favoring stride, the two of them moving at exactly the pace the other needed without either having to ask. In the evenings, Walt took to sitting on the narrow deck with a battered logbook he'd kept, on and off since his Navy days, and writing down in the same clipped, economical handwriting he'd used to log Bexley's training progress 20 years earlier, the small increments of her return to herself. Day 4, flinched at a passing outboard, recovered in under a minute, first time under 2. Day 11, took food from my hand instead of the bowl, first time since the boat. Day 19, slept through a thunderstorm. There was an afternoon some 3 weeks in, when a marina neighbor's grandson, visiting for the summer, came barreling down the dock chasing a runaway frisbee and very nearly collided with Bexley where she lay in a patch of sun outside the Constance's cockpit, and Walt watched, heart in his throat, as every muscle in her body went instantly rigid, the same coiled readiness he'd seen at the base of the yacht's gangway. But instead of the lunge he half expected, she simply rose, unhurried, placed herself between the boy and the open water with the same calm, deliberate positioning she'd have used protecting a compound perimeter, and stood there, solid and unthreatening, until the boy's grandmother called him back and the moment passed uneventfully. Walt had sat very still through the whole of it, hand resting on the hull beside him, and understood, watching her, that whatever else the intervening years and the false training had layered onto her, the animal underneath it all had never actually stopped being the same dog he'd raised, steady, protective, built to place herself, without hesitation, between danger and whoever she'd decided was hers to guard. She had simply, for 11 months, been guarding the wrong things, for the wrong reasons, for a man who'd never once earned it. Pearl, the schoolteacher, once she heard the whole story over a second helping of banana bread on Walt's narrow deck, took to bringing scraps of good cheese down the dock for Bexley twice a week, a habit the dog accepted with the same grave, unhurried dignity she brought to everything, and Big Tom from Ortiz's crew, Walt had picked up his own share of odd landscaping work over the years. Same marina towns, same overlapping circle of men who did the jobs nobody glamorous wanted. Stopped by more than once just to sit on the dock and watch the dog work through a training exercise Walt still ran most mornings out of old habit, more for the shared rhythm of it than any real doubt about her abilities. "Look at her go," Tom said once, watching Bexley hold a rock-steady sit-stay through the blast of a passing jet ski's wake, water spraying up over the dock boards inches from her paws without so much as a twitch. "Man, they don't make dogs like that anymore." Walt, without looking away from Bexley, had said, quiet, "They do. Somebody's just got to raise them right and then not let anybody take that away from them." And Tom hadn't had much to say back to that, only nodded, the way men do when something's been said that's truer than the conversation was built to hold. Pearl, the schoolteacher, got her stern cleat replaced a week later than promised, and did not mind in the slightest once she heard why, and made, in celebration, a double batch of banana bread that Walt shared that evening, sitting on the Constance's narrow deck with the sun going down orange over the water, with a dog who had crossed 19 years and a marina's length of dock to find her way back to the one whistle in the world that had ever meant, unmistakably and only, home. Michelle drove down from Charlotte 2 weekends later, sooner than her usual twice-a-month phone calls would have predicted, because Walt had told her the whole of it over the phone, and her voice had gone quiet in a way he recognized as her working hard not to cry where he could hear it. She arrived at the marina on a Saturday morning with a duffel bag and an expression Walt hadn't seen on her face in years. Somewhere between disbelief and a hope, she seemed almost afraid to fully let herself feel, and when Bexley came up the dock to meet her, tail low and careful the way she still was with strangers, Michelle had crouched down slow, the way Walt had taught her over the phone to do, and let the dog come to her instead of reaching first. "She's beautiful," Michelle said, quiet, running a hand along Bexley's flank once the dog had decided, after a long, considering moment, that this particular stranger was safe. "Dad, I don't think I understood all these years how much this actually—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Walt understood exactly what she meant, because he'd spent 19 years failing to explain it to her in words, and here it was, finally, explaining itself. They spent that whole weekend, the way Walt hadn't spent a weekend with his daughter in longer than either of them cared to count precisely. Slow mornings on the Constance's deck, Bexley stretched between them in the sun, Michelle asking careful questions about the deployments Walt had never talked about before, not because she was prying, but because the dog lying between them seemed, somehow, to make the old stories safe to tell for the first time. Walt found himself describing the Strait of Hormuz crossing in detail he hadn't shared with anyone, not even Carol in all their years married, watching his daughter's face as she listened, and understood, somewhere in the middle of it, that Bexley's return had not only given him back a piece of his own life, but had quietly, without either of them planning it, opened a door between him and Michelle that 19 years of phone calls had never quite managed to pry open on their own. "You should have told me," Michelle said, that Sunday evening before she drove back north, not with any real anger in it, more a kind of gentle grief for all the years the silence had cost them both. "About any of it, I would have understood." "I know that now," Walt said. "Took a dog crossing a dock to teach me." She hugged him longer than usual before she left, and hugged Bexley too, crouched down at the dog's level with her arms around the thick fur of her neck, and told her, half laughing and half not, that she'd better take good care of her father, and Bexley had answered with the soft double tap of her paw against Michelle's knee, a gesture Walt had never seen her offer to anyone outside himself before. And he stood on the dock watching his daughter's car pull out of the marina, Lot feeling something in his chest that had been closed a long time finally, cautiously, easing open. Castellane, to his credit, and Walt would say this for the man, in the months that followed, even on days when he had plenty of other things he could have said instead, did not try to make the problem quietly disappear the way a man of his resources certainly could have. He put his own legal team on it, filed a formal complaint with the federal investigators who handled military property fraud, and paid, without being asked, for the forensic accounting work that eventually traced Ambrose's falsified paperwork trail back far enough to support a federal indictment. Ambrose was arrested 9 weeks later at a residence 2 states away, federal agents moving in at dawn on a Tuesday with a warrant built substantially on the timeline Walt and Reyes had helped assemble, and the owner of Meridian Tactical Canine, Devin Farrow, who had built a profitable business on the specific, cynical calculation that grieving handlers rarely had the resources to chase down what had been taken from them. was indicted alongside him on charges of trafficking in stolen government property and wire fraud. Walt did not attend the arraignment himself, had no particular need to see either man in a courtroom to feel the matter settled, but Culch called him that afternoon with the details anyway, and Walt sat on the Constance's deck with the phone against his ear and Bexley's head heavy across his knee, and listened to an account of the bail hearing with a flatness in his own chest that surprised him. Not triumph, exactly, nothing so satisfying as that, just the quiet, settled feeling of a debt finally being called in after 19 years of nobody bothering to collect it. The federal prosecutor handling the case, a careful, thorough woman named Assistant U.S. Attorney Renata Diaz, reached out to Walt directly in the weeks that followed, wanting his account on the record, and Walt gave it to her the same way he'd have given a debrief after any mission: plain facts, no embellishment, dates and names laid out in order, though his voice did catch, despite his best effort to keep it steady, on the part where he described the sound Bexley had made coming down that dock. Diaz told him gently that the detail mattered more to the case than he probably realized. Beck. Oz a jury could be shown paperwork all day and feel nothing, but they'd remember, when it came to it, the image of a decorated military dog crossing a private dock at a full run to reach a man she hadn't seen in 19 years. Farrow pleaded out eventually, 11 months later, rather than risk a trial with that image sitting in front of a jury, and the plea agreement included restitution to every handler whose dog could still be traced, a sum that would never fully account for what had actually been taken but which Walt, when his own portion of it arrived, donated in full and without hesitation to the reunification effort he and Castellane had built in the meantime, because he had never once been chasing money. And did not intend to start now that some had finally, belatedly, come his way. Castellane offered Walt money, eventually, a sum considerably larger than the $40,000 he'd paid for a dog that was never legally his to buy, and Walt turned most of it down the way he turned down plenty of things in his life that felt like they were meant to settle a debt that money couldn't actually touch, though he did accept enough to cover the boat repairs he'd been putting off for years and a proper vet workup to make sure Bexley's joints, aging now same as his own, would hold up for whatever years the two of them had left together. What he asked for instead, when Castellane pressed him, sitting once more in that same leather chair in the yacht study with Bexley's chin resting heavy across both his knees, was smaller and larger at the same time. He asked Castellane to fund, publicly this time, unlike the quiet work he'd already done with the investigation, a proper registry and reunification effort for military working dogs separated from their handlers under circumstances nobody had bothered to track closely enough, so that no other handler would spend 19 years believing a closed door was the end of the story. Castellane agreed and did more than agree. He put his own name and no small amount of his own money behind it, and the effort, modest at first, grew over the following year into something that mattered, something with a real staff and a real budget and a growing list of handlers and dogs it had managed to reconnect. It was Castellane, in fact, who insisted the registry carry Bexley's own service number as its founding case file, over Walt's initial and somewhat gruff objection that he hadn't done any of this to get his name on anything. "It's not about your name," Castellane told him, the day the paperwork was finalized. "It's about making sure the next Curtis Ambrose knows somebody's watching the file. That only works if the file has a face on it people remember." Walt hadn't had a good answer for that and had let it stand. The registry's first public reunification, 6 months after the gala on the dock, happened at a small county park outside Norfolk, and Walt drove up for it himself with Bexley riding in the passenger seat of a truck he'd finally allowed himself to buy, because Marcus Webb had asked him to come, had said, over the phone, that it wouldn't feel complete without the man who'd made the first call. Walt stood at the edge of a gravel lot that afternoon and watched Webb go to his knees on the grass, the same way Walt himself had gone to his knees on a dock 6 months earlier, watched a Belgian Malinois named Scout cross the last 20 feet of open ground at a dead run into a man's outstretched arms, and felt something in his own chest go tight and warm at once, the particular ache of watching someone else receive the exact thing you'd spent 19 years grieving the loss of yourself. Bexley beside him sat through the whole scene with her ears up and her attention fixed, and when it was over she pressed her head, once deliberate, against Walt's hip, a small private acknowledgement that seemed to Walt to say she understood exactly what she was watching, better than most of the humans standing around them did. He still did dock work most mornings, still kept the Constance afloat with the same stubborn patience as always, still wore the same faded ball cap with the ghost of an anchor stitched over the brim. But most evenings now, when the light went orange over the water and the halyards ticked against the masts up and down Belhaven Marina, Walt Hendricks sat on the deck of his narrow old boat with a dog's head heavy across his knee, her paw resting where it always rested now, deliberate and possessive, across the top of his boot, and understood in the particular quiet of that hour that some things the world takes from you do, occasionally, against every reasonable expectation, find their way back. And that when they do, the only sensible thing left to do is sit very still and let them. If this story reached you the way it reached us, take a second and hit that like button. It helps stories about the bond between veterans and the working dogs who served beside them find the people who need them most. Subscribe if you're new here, because there are more stories like Walt and Bexley's still waiting to be told. Tell us in the comments what part of this one stayed with you. We read every one of them. And if you know someone who'd appreciate a story about loyalty that outlasts 19 years and a locked filing cabinet, go ahead and send this their way. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.